1914, the fatal shot in Sarajevo ignited the fire of the First World War, but not suspecting how difficult and lengthy the confrontation would be, all parties to the conflict expected to win a quick and decisive victory. The German Empire, even before the start of the war, developed its own plan of action. The German command planned to concentrate the main forces on the Western Front in order to win a quick victory over France. On the Eastern Front, Germany deployed only the 8th Army with a total number of about 200,000 soldiers, placing it in fortified areas on the main directions, planning to hold the defense until the defeat of France and only then transferring additional forces to carry out an offensive on the Eastern Front. Austria-Hungary, on the contrary, was preparing for offensive actions by concentrating the 1st, 3rd and 4th Armies, as well as a separate army group under the command of General Hermann Kovács, on the border with the Russian Empire. Thus, Austria-Hungary concentrated about 850,000 soldiers on the border with the Russian Empire. As for the Russian Empire, it deployed troops simultaneously in two directions, against Germany and against Austria-Hungary. The 1st and 2nd Armies with a total number of 250,000 soldiers under the command of General Zelensky were concentrated in the north, and the 3rd, 4th, 5th and 8th Armies were located in the south with a total number of 600,000 soldiers under the command of General Ivanov. The overall command of the northern and southern groups of troops of the Russian Empire was exercised by Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. According to the plans of the Russian command, the main efforts were to be concentrated against the army of Austria-Hungary, and the Russian army was to begin active offensive actions only after the deployment of units was fully completed, but it turned out differently. The fact is that the French command managed to convince the Russian command to launch an offensive before the completion of reconnaissance of the units and at the same time deliver a simultaneous blow to the Austro-Hungarian and German armies in order to force Germany to transfer divisions from the Western to the Eastern Front and thereby weaken the pressure on the Allied positions along Entente. On August 17, 1914, the Russian army launched an offensive in the north with the forces of the 1st and 2nd Armies under the command of Rennenkampf and Samsonov. On this day, units of the 1st Army invaded the territory of East Prussia from the east. The Russian 2nd Army launched an offensive only on August 20, planning to strike the rear and flank of the 8th German Army, which was providing protection for Prussia. In turn, the German command allocated 1 corps to contain the 2nd Russian Army, and planned to use the remaining 3 corps to defeat the 1st Russian Army. German units attacked the advancing Russian 1st Army on August 20 near the city of Gumbinnen. In the ensuing battle, both sides suffered heavy losses. The German corps under the command of General François was forced to retreat, and the 2nd German corps under the command of Mackensen, which was advancing south of the city, was completely defeated, losing more than half of its personnel. After the retreat of the German units, there was a serious threat of encirclement of the entire German 8th Army, which is why General Prittwitz ordered his units to begin a retreat from East Prussia and take up defensive positions on the banks of the Vistula River. But the German headquarters intervened, ordering an end to the retreat and transferring 2 corps and a cavalry division from the Western Front to Prussia. Already on August 21, Prittwitz was dismissed, and General Hindenburg took over as commander of the 8th Army. The new commander decided to leave 2.5 divisions, which were supposed to, relying on the previously created fortified areas, slow down the advance of the 1st Russian Army, and use all remaining forces to defeat Samsonov's 2nd Russian Army. In turn, the command of the Russian Army, having discovered the rapid retreat of the German troops, reasonably decided that the enemy would leave Prussia and retreat to positions more convenient for defense in order to avoid encirclement of his army. Not knowing that the 8th German Army had a new commander, who cancelled the order of his predecessor to retreat, the command of the Russian Army changed the original plan of the operation, which involved the unification of the 1st and 2nd Armies for a joint offensive deep into Prussia. Both armies were ordered to change the direction of advance in order to intercept the retreating Germans, preventing them from leaving Prussia. Thus, the Russian armies, changing the direction of attack, moved away from each other, which ultimately became a fatal mistake. A large gap formed between the Russian armies, which the German army took advantage of by attacking the flank of Samsonov's army. On August 26, the Germans launched a flank attack, which came as a complete surprise to General Samsonov, who, knowing that the 6th Corps of his army, which was advancing on the right flank, had been defeated, continued to advance deep into Prussia. On the same day, the Germans attacked the left flank of Samsonov's army, which also could not withstand the enemy's onslaught. Successful flank attacks by the Germans led to the loss of control of the Russian Second Army, which began a disorganized retreat, losing about 30,000 soldiers and 200 guns. Having learned about what happened on the night of August 30th, General Samsonov shot himself. The Second Russian Army was practically defeated, so the German command decided to concentrate efforts on the fight against the First Russian Army, which at that time managed to blockade Königsberg. The German command decided to take advantage of their numerical advantage to attack the enemy's stretched left flank and, pressing the First Russian Army to the coast, force it to capitulate. Despite the German superiority in numbers and artillery, the Russians still managed to repulse the attack on the left flank, but since the situation was critical, on September 10, 1914, Rennenkampf gave his army the order to begin a retreat. By the morning of September 13, the First Russian Army managed to retreat beyond the Neman River while maintaining combat effectiveness. By September 17, the Germans managed not only to oust the Russian army from Prussia, but also to invade the territory of the Russian Empire, occupying the cities of Suwałki and Augusto. On the southern part of the front, the Russian army launched an offensive simultaneously with the offensive in East Prussia. The 4th and 5th Russian armies attacked towards the cities of Krasnik and Komarov, but faced with fierce resistance from the 1st and 4th Austrian armies, on September 2 they were forced to retreat and take up defensive positions. The 3rd and 8th Russian armies, which launched the offensive at the same time, were much more successful. Already on August 23, the 8th Russian army managed to overcome the Siret River, continuing to move forward. On August 25, the 3rd Austrian army on the Zolotea Lipa River tried to stop the advance of the 3rd Russian army. As a result of a fierce battle, the Austrian army was forced to retreat and take up defensive positions on the Rotten Lipa River. In the new battle, victory again fell on the side of the 3rd Russian army, which, having defeated the enemy, forced him to retreat. Meanwhile, the 8th Army managed to defeat the 12th Austro-Hungarian Corps and threaten the encirclement of the entire Austro-Hungarian group in the Lemberg area. In this situation, the Austrian troops were forced to hastily retreat, and the cities of Gallic and Lemberg fell into the hands of the Russian army. Meanwhile, the 4th and 5th Russian armies, which had taken up the defensive, received reinforcements, which allowed them to go on the offensive again, which this time turned out to be successful. By September 4, they managed to defeat the enemy and force him to retreat. To save the situation, the Austrian command hastily concentrated 3 of its armies against the 2 Russians in order to secure a numerical superiority and launch a counterattack in the direction of Rava-Ruska. Despite the numerical superiority of the enemy in heavy battles near Rava-Ruska, the Russian Imperial Army managed to stop the enemy's advances. Already on September 11, the Austrians began retreating across the San River. Thus, by mid-September, the eastern part of western Galicia, as well as most of Bukovina, was in the hands of the Russian army, which, continuing the offensive, besieged Przemysl. Having reached the Carpathian Mountains, the Russian army planned to launch an offensive into Hungary, since the forces remaining with the Austrians were clearly insufficient to organize an effective defense. Meanwhile, in East Prussia, having received reinforcements in the form of the 10th Army, Russian troops went on the offensive. Having repelled a counterattack by the German army in the Suwałki area, the Russians managed to once again invade Prussian territory by the beginning of October. Very soon the Russian army managed to reach the Line-Gumbinnen, Masurian lakes and began to gain a foothold on new frontiers. Since the Austrian army was practically defeated, the situation for the Central Powers on the Eastern Front was critical. In order to prevent a catastrophe, Germany was forced to come to the aid of its ally by moving part of its forces to Silesia, where the 9th German Army was formed, led by Mackensen. In order to prevent the invasion of the Russian army into Silesia, the German command decided to launch strikes towards Warsaw and Ivangorod with the forces of the 9th German and 1st Austrian armies. The offensive began on September 28 and developed quite successfully. Having pushed through the defenses of the Russian army, the Central Powers managed to cross the Vistula and reach the line of Warsaw forts. But at this point the advance of the 9th German Army was stopped by the well-organized Russian defense. On October 9, having received reinforcements, General Ivanov gave the order to launch a counteroffensive. The Russian Fifth Army crossed the Vistula south of Warsaw, and the Fourth Army launched an offensive from the Ivangorod area to attack the flank and rear of the enemy group. Under the onslaught of Russian troops, the First Austrian Army was forced to hastily retreat, which was taken advantage of by the 9th Russian Army, which struck the gap between the 1st Austrian and 9th German armies, planning to go to their rear. Since the troops of the Central Powers could not stop the advance of the 9th Russian Army, they were under the threat of complete defeat. On October 27, in order to avoid destruction, the Austro-German troops began a hasty retreat, which, however, turned out to be quite successful, since the Central Powers managed to withdraw most of their forces from the outskirts of Warsaw. Having successfully repelled the enemy's attempt to attack Warsaw, the Russian command drew up a plan for its own offensive with the forces of the 1st, 2nd, and 5th Armies deep into the German Empire, which made it possible to deprive Germany of the opportunity to provide support to the Austro-Hungarian army, and, therefore, could lead to the defeat of Austria-Hungary, which needed time to replenish its bloodless armies. Unfortunately for the Russian command, the German command managed to unravel this plan. Realizing that after regrouping it would be difficult to stop the advancing Russian troops, the German command decided to launch a preemptive strike, attacking the Russians before they had time to prepare for the attack. For the attack it was planned to use the 9th German Army, which was to be supported by the 3rd German Cavalry Corps, the Posen and Breslau Corps, as well as a group of troops of General Wojsz and the 2nd Austro-Hungarian Army. On November 11, the 9th German Army struck at the junction of the 1st and 2nd Russian armies, securing an overwhelming numerical advantage at the forefront of the attack. Under the onslaught of the 9th German Army, the Russian troops were forced to retreat, but having gained a foothold in new positions, the Russians still managed to stop the enemy attack. Elsewhere, the attacking troops of the Central Powers were unable to break through the Russian army's defenses. The Germans began to maneuver to allow them to find a gap in the defenses of the Russian army northeast of the city of Lodz. Despite the initial success, the army of the Central Powers was unable to completely blockade the city. In addition, the group of troops that broke through the Russian defenses itself found itself under the threat of encirclement. In this situation, on November 22, Schaeffer's group received orders to begin a retreat. The Germans still managed to prevent Schaeffer's group from being encircled, but during the battles and breakthrough to the north, it lost more than 2/3 of its personnel captured and killed. Although the Lodz operation failed because, having suffered serious losses, the armies of the Central Powers were forced to retreat to their original positions, but at the same time, the unexpected German offensive thwarted the plans of the Russian command to invade the depths of the German Empire, and the commanders of the 1st and 2nd Russian armies were removed. Also in November, the Russian army carried out an offensive operation towards Krakow and, despite enemy resistance, it managed to reach the approaches to Krakow and Czestochowa, but due to the initial success of the enemy during the Lodz operation, the Russian army was ordered to leave the vicinity of Krakow and Czestochowa, returning to starting positions. Despite the setbacks in Prussia, 1914 was quite successful for the Russian army. The fact is that the actions of the Russian army completely buried the German Blitzkrieg plan. Due to difficulties on the Eastern Front, the German command had to quickly transfer military units from the Western Front, which in turn did not allow them to quickly win a victory over France, as envisaged in the original plan. At the same time, the transfer of German divisions from the Western Front did not allow the Russian army to defeat Austria-Hungary and force it to capitulate. By the end of 1914, the fighting took on a positional character, as both sides of the conflict were forced to make changes to their military plans, realizing that victory would not be achieved quickly. At the same time, none of the opponents yet understood how long and difficult the war would be, and also that the bloodiest battles lay ahead. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.